primarily on the planet currently Earth.
On August 13th in 1521, the Aztec capital of Tinochitlan fell to Cortez. After a 3-month siege, Spanish forces under Hernan Cortez captured Tinochitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Cortez's men leveled the city and captured Cuauhtemoc, the Aztec emperor. Tenochtitlan was founded in 1325 AD by a wandering tribe of hunters and gatherers on islands in Lake Texcoco, near the present site of Mexico City. In only 1 century, this civilization grew into the Aztec Empire, largely because of its advanced system of agriculture. The empire came to dominate central Mexico, and by the ascendance of Montezuma II in 1502 had reached its greatest extent, extending as far south as perhaps modern-day Nicaragua. At the time, the empire was held together primarily by Aztec military strength, and Montezuma II set about establishing a bureaucracy, creating provinces that would pay tribute to the imperial capital of Tenochtitlan. The conquered peoples resented the Aztec demands for tribute and victims for the religious sacrifices, but the Aztec military kept rebellion at bay. Meanwhile, Hernan Cortez, a young Spanish-born noble, came to Hispaniola in the West Indies in 1504. In 1511, he sailed with Diego Velázquez to conquer Cuba and twice was elected mayor of Santiago, the capital of Hispaniola. In 1580, he was appointed captain general of a new Spanish expedition to the American mainland. Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, later rescinded the order, and Cortez sailed without permission. He visited the coast of Yucatan, and in March 1519 landed at Tabasco in Mexico's Bay of Campeche with 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, and 16 horses. There he won over the local Indians and was given a female slave, Malinche, baptized Marina, who became his mistress and later bore him a son. She knew both Maya and Aztec and served as an interpreter. The expedition then proceeded up the Mexican coast, where Cortez founded Veracruz, mainly for the purpose of having himself elected captain general by the colony, thus shaking off the authority of Velázquez and making him responsible only to King Charles V of Spain. At Veracruz, Cortez trained his army and then burned his ships to ensure loyalty to his plans for conquest. Having learned of political strife in the Aztec Empire, Cortez led his force into the Mexican interior. On the way to Tenochtitlan, he clashed with local Indians, but many of these people, including the nation of Tlaxcala, became his allies after learning of his plan to conquer their hated Aztec rulers. Hearing of the approach of Cortez with his frightful horses and sophisticated weapons, Montezuma II tried to buy him off, but Cortez would not be dissuaded. On November 8th in 1519, the Spaniards and their 1,000 Texcaltec warriors were allowed to enter Tenochtitlan unopposed. Montezuma suspected them to be divine envoys of the god Quetzalcoatl, who was prophesied to return from the east in a one-reed year, which was 1519 on the Aztec calendar. The Spaniards were greeted with great honor, and Cortez seized the opportunity, taking Montezuma hostage so that he might govern the empire through him. His mistress, Marina, was a great help in this endeavor and succeeded in convincing Montezuma to cooperate fully. In the spring of 1520, Cortez learned of the arrival of a Spanish force from Cuba, led by Panfilo Narvaez and sent by Velázquez to deprive Cortez of his command. Cortez led his army out to Tenochtitlan to meet them, leaving behind a garrison of 80 Spaniards and a few hundred Tlaxcaltecs to govern the city. Cortez defeated Narvaez and enlisted Narvaez's army into his own. When he returned to Tenochtitlan in June, he found the garrison under siege from the Aztec, who had rebelled after the subordinate whom Cortez left in command of the city massacred several Aztec chiefs and the population on the brink of revolt. On June 30th, under pressure and lacking food, Cortez and his men fought their way out of the capital at heavy cost. Known to the Spanish as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sadness, many soldiers drowned in Lake Texcoco when the vessel carrying them and Aztec treasures hoarded by Cortez sank. Montezuma continued his eternity in the fighting, in Aztec reports by Spaniards, and the Spanish reports by an Aztec mob bitter at Montezuma's subservience to Spanish rule. He was succeeded as emperor by his brother, Cuitlahuac. During the Spaniards' retreat, they defeated a large Aztec army at Otamba and then rejoined their Tlaxcaltec allies. In May 1521, Cortez returned to Tinochitlan, and after a 3-month siege, the city fell. This victory marked the fall of the Aztec Empire. Cuauhtemoc, Cuitlahuac's successor as emperor, was taken prisoner and later executed, continuing his eternity, and Cortez became the ruler of a vast Mexican empire. The Spanish conquistador led an expedition to Honduras in 1524, and in 1528 returned to Spain to see the king. Charles made him Marquis de la Valle, but refused to name him governor because of his quarrels with Velázquez and others. In 1530, he returned to Mexico, now known as New Spain, and found the country in disarray. After restoring some order, he retired to his estate south of Mexico City and sent out maritime expeditions from the Pacific coast. In 1540, he returned to Spain and was neglected by the court. He continued his eternity in 1547. On August 13th in 1961, shortly after midnight, East German soldiers began laying down barbed wire and bricks as a barrier between Soviet-controlled East Berlin and the democratic western section of the city. After World War II, defeated Germany was divided into Soviet, American, British, and French zones of occupation. The city of Berlin, though technically part of the Soviet zone, was also split, with the Soviets taking the eastern part of the city. After a massive Allied airlift in June of 1948 foiled a Soviet attempt to blockade West Berlin, the eastern section was drawn even more tightly into the Soviet fold. Over the next 12 years, cut off from its western counterpart and basically reduced to a Soviet satellite, East Germany saw between 2.5 million and 3 million of its citizens head to West Germany in search of better opportunities. By 1961, some 1,000 East Germans, including many skilled laborers, professionals, and intellectuals, were leaving every day. In August, Walter Ulbricht, the communist leader of East Germany, got the go-ahead from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to begin the sealing off of all access between East and West Berlin. Soldiers began the work over the night of August 12th through 13th, laying more than 100 miles of barbed wire slightly inside the East Berlin border. The wire was soon replaced by a 6-foot-high, 96-mile-long wall of concrete blocks, complete with guard towers, machine gun posts, and searchlights. East German officers, known as Volkspolizei, patrolled the Berlin Wall day and night. Let's try that again. Volkspolizei. We'll check it to make sure it's right. It's actually Volkspolizei. Many Berlin residents on that first morning found themselves suddenly cut off from friends or family members in the other half of the city. Led by their mayor, Willy Brandt, West Berliners demonstrated against the wall as Brandt criticized Western democracies, particularly our country, the United States, for failing to take a stand against it. Our 35th president, John F. Kennedy, had earlier said publicly that the United States could only really help West Berliners and West Germans, and that any kind of action on behalf of East Germans would result in failure. The Berlin Wall was one of the most powerful and iconic symbols of the Cold War. In June of 1963, Kennedy gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner speech, in front of the wall, celebrating the city as a symbol of freedom and democracy in its resistance to tyranny and oppression. The height of the wall was raised to 10 feet in 1970 in an effort to stop escape attempts, which at that time came almost daily. From 1961 to 1989, a total of 5,000 East Germans escaped. Many more tried and failed. High-profile shootings of some would-be defectors only intensified the Western world's hatred of that wall. Finally, in the late 1980s, East Germany, fueled by the decline of the Soviet Union, began to implement a number of liberal reforms. On November 9th in 1989, masses of East and West Germans alike gathered at the Berlin Wall and began to climb over and dismantle it. As this symbol of Cold War repression was destroyed, East and West Germany became one nation again, signing a formal treaty of unification on October 3rd, 1990. On August 13th in 1981, at his California home, Rancho del Cielo, Ronald Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, ERTA, a package of tax and budget reductions that set the tone for his administration's trickle-down economic policy. During his campaign for the White House in 1980, Reagan argued on behalf of supply-side economics, the theory of using tax cuts as incentives for individuals and businesses to work and produce goods, which is supply, rather than as an incentive for customers to buy goods, which is the demand. In Congress, Representative Jack Kemp, a Republican from New York, and Senator Bill Roth, a Republican from Delaware, had long supported the supply-side principles behind ERTA, which would also be known as the Kemp-Roth Act. The bill, which received bipartisan support in Congress, represented a significant change in the course of federal income tax policy, which until then was believed by most people to work best when used to affect demand during times of recession. The ERTA included a 25% reduction in marginal tax rates for individuals, phased in over 3 years and indexed for inflation from that point on. The marginal tax rate, or the tax rate on the last dollar earned, was considered more important to economic activity than the average tax rate, as it affected income earned through extra activities such as education, entrepreneurship, or investment. Reducing marginal tax rates, the theory went, would help the economy grow faster through such extra efforts by individuals and businesses. The 1981 Act, combined with another major tax reform act in 1986, cut marginal tax rates on high-income taxpayers from 70% to around 30%, and would be the defining economic legacy of Reagan's presidency. Reagan's tax cuts were designed to put maximum emphasis on encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship and creating incentives for the development of venture capital and greater investment in human capital through training and education. The cuts particularly benefited idea industries such as software or financial services. Fittingly, Reagan's first term saw the advent of the information revolution, including IBM's introduction of its first personal computer and the rise or launch of such tech companies as Intel, Microsoft, Dell, Sun Microsystems, Compaq, and Cisco Systems. Economists have argued to what degree Reagan's economic policy drove the boom of the 1990s, but his tax program undoubtedly set in motion powerful forces of change that will result in both short and long-term economic gains. On the other hand, critics of so-called Reaganomics point out that his tax cuts and the effects of steady economic growth disproportionately benefited the wealthy and vastly increased the gap between the nation's rich and poor. The historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.